Welcome to Lockdown Live Storytelling. The flowers are completely awesome from my garden. They opened spectacularly from last night. If you're paying attention at the beginning of last night's, you know that these were my annual gift from my ex, was to give me a bag of dirt and or a bag of manure, which were my requests so that I could have flowers whenever. And dude, they did not disappoint. So I was thinking about expectations. The expectation that someone's going to give you flowers, the expectation that you're going to be like someone that you came from. You're going to be like the people who raised you. You're going to be like the environment from which you came. And sometimes we worry that we're going to be like somebody that we don't want to be like in our family. In my case, it was my dad. And sometimes people expect us to be a certain way. If we come from a certain environment or a certain family, we either don't live up to or live down to those expectations. So this story is from the first book, Tell Me a Story. And it's called Birch Finds Its Roots. In the beginning, there was a wondrous tree that grew in the center of a wide and open field. Its branches spread out and gave shade to the ground beneath. Its trunk was white as snow, its leaves of the finest gold. In the spring it flowered and gave off a scent that could make dreams into reality and reality into dreams. Seasons changed, and in time the great tree would produce many seeds. Some would drop on the earth, others would blow across the field. Still others would be carried by birds and field mice to far-off lands. Some would perish. Most would grow and drop seeds of their own. Every seed was unique in all the world, and each tree that grew would be a variation of the great tree, but none could duplicate it precisely. One tree grew in rocky soil and chose to lean towards the shade rather than the sun, and in the shade it became bent and gnarled. Having such obvious flaws made the tree angry. All of my siblings are perfect and straight, the young tree complained to the great tree. I hate them. I will send my roots out to choke them. I will stretch my branches to shade all that I see whenever I can. The great tree sighed. My child. It said, you're unique in all the world. You are my child, and I love you. I beg you, don't harm the others. Find beauty in your strangeness, glory in your twists and your bends. The dark tree could not find glory in its lot in life, and it went ahead and did the harm that it promised. Many trees suffered. Nature is far-seeing, and even the most bent and gnarled tree can produce seeds and continue the cycle of life. And so it was for the dark tree. Not being as large and healthy as the others, it could only produce 3 seeds. All landed in the sun. All took to the soil and grew. When they were just seedlings, they looked across the field at their sire, and they worried. It's so dark and bent, said the first seedling. What if we grow as dark and do as much harm? I'm going to close my eyes so that I never look at it or anything that reminds me of its terrible ways. I shall never be like that, said the second. I'd rather die than be like that one. I shall only look away from it. And so I will grow straight and tall and perfect, and I shall pretend it does not exist. The third seedling thought hard about this decision. I shall look at it and never look away. For I must always be reminded of where I might go wrong. They all grew up. The first tree kept its eyes closed and could never tell where the sun was coming from. It sent out runners and roots in search of direction. By accident, it choked several other trees. The tree became so confused that it began to bend towards the earth instead of the sky. It cried in despair. It wept so hard that its leaves became tears flowing down its long, thin arms. The weeping willow was a very lonely tree. The second tree found that the only way to keep from being reminded of the dark tree was to look straight up at the sky. It never cried. It held everything inside. It built thick walls around its trunk and its arms. The fear it could not contain grew out of its walls in long, thin, sharp spikes. Anyone going too near cactus would be speared. It was self-sufficient, but too thorny to be good company. Through it all, the great tree looked on and grew sad. "Oh, my poor suffering children," it said, "can none of you find your way in this world?" The third tree had spent its life looking upon the dark tree. It had come to know all of its many facets. It saw the straight and the bent. It watched the other trees and felt sad and ashamed. The third tree became thin and frail, a mix of papery white bark and black knots. Its leaves were green on top and silver beneath. It knew it would not live so long as the other trees, and it yearned for a way to reconcile its fear and its hopes. One day the birch, for that is what it had become, stood looking at the dark tree. The dark tree waved at it. In all the years, this had never happened. Then the birch heard the dark tree's voice carried on the wind. "You have some of my coloring in you, my child," the dark tree said. "Parts of you are dark. You will carry on my name. Sink your roots deep to hold you down, and then choke off your neighbors. Clear a path for yourself." Hearing this, the great tree shook. Though there was no wind that day, the golden leaves stirred and waved. "Little birch, hear me now," the great tree said in a rich and flowing voice. "You have spent your life looking at your sire. Now look up. See me instead. I came before the dark tree that bore you. You are part of me as well. Your roots run back to me," the great tree said. "You make the choice as to how you will grow, straight or bent, happy or sad, pointed or smooth." The dark tree would have none of this. It wanted a partner, and it would have this young one snatched away. It had waited too long for this triumph. "Do not look up, Birch," the tree said. "You are not strong enough. You will snap. You will shatter. Keep only me in your sights, and all will be as it should." The great tree knew that the little tree was frightened. It could see it shuddering. "Be not afraid," the great tree said. "I know what is within you, for it came from me." With those words, the great tree released its golden leaves into the air, but instead of raining down to the ground, they floated high in the air. Like a million golden butterflies, they fluttered across the field and came to fill the air around the birch. The golden leaves gave off a scent that could make dreams into reality, and reality into dreams. They warmed the little tree, and the light that seemed to shine from them soaked deep into its bark. Then they fluttered back to the great tree and stood back on the branches. "Rise, little one," the voice said. "Look up at me and bend. You will not break now." So the little birch tree looked up at the great tree and saw it in all of its glory. The little tree saw the white bark and knew it was a variation of the great tree. "You have both your sire's darkness and my light upon you," the great tree said. "It is up to you to decide which you will favor." Little Birch reached out and waved to the great tree. It swayed back and forth in celebration of this new discovery. "I will look up to you. it said in a little silvery voice that was all its own, I will bend to you, reach for you, and I will remember you. I will always remember that I come from you. You're my real parent. Never again will I fix my gaze on the dark, now that I've seen your golden light. The leaves of the great tree shone with pride, while the birch was only one more little tree among forests of trees. It was a start. With an open heart and a little guidance, seedlings could grow into great trees. I wrote that story initially when I was worried that I would grow up to be like my father, even though I was already an adult. He wasn't the best of men. And I worried because he was an author. And so I refused to be one, even as I wrote all of these stories, and even as I got my first book contract for that book, I almost didn't allow them to be published because in my mind, becoming an author made me like him. And then the publisher, a lady named Lillian Meow at Paraclete Press, explained to me that being an author might be like him, but the stories that I was telling were anything but. So our second and final story is a continuation of the story of my friend Betty Bruno from Florida, who lived in the little pink house and who went to live in the home of the crane. And this is called The Teller and the Crane. Over a tiny village by the bay, a large and dazzling white bird circled low. The beautiful bird stretched its enormous wings wide, and its sharp eyes looked out on every detail beneath. How had it come to pass the tiny pink house of the old storyteller had fallen into disrepair? Why was it that the boats that had once been bright and clean now sat idle and shabby? The warm breeze that had stirred the palms were still. The candy-striped tree snails that had once glistened like little jewels on the branches of the gumbo limbo trees were nowhere in sight. The great crane felt a heaviness in its heart. The bird made many visits to the village. Betty, the old woman, who had for years been the storyteller, had always woven the crane's insights into her tales for the children and adults. When a new teller had been ready to take her place, the crane had come and carried Betty to its home in the sky. The new teller was just a small child when Betty was called away, but the crane had chosen the new teller carefully and instructed her well. In the years since, the white bird had come to her often and told her many, many new tales. What could have gone wrong? The bird decided to change its appearance and to land at the village docks disguised as a common pelican. No sooner had the bird touched the wooden docks when a hail of words came at it with a terrible force. The bird felt the pain of the words just as it would feel a rock or a sharp stick that might have hit its feathers. "Hey, you lazy thing! Get out here and get to work!" An old man on the shore was yelling. "You are good for nothing. You're nothing but slow and stupid." Out of the boathouse came a young boy with sandy-colored hair and dark green eyes. The boy looked sad and angry all at the same time. "I may be slow, I may be stupid, but I'm smarter than you," he shouted back. "At least I know better than to stay where I'm not wanted." So saying, he stormed off down the path and into the village and up to the general store. More than a store, the old building had always been a friendly greeting place for breakfasts and village events, but it didn't seem so now. The pelican flew high into the sky and changed into a sparrow. The little bird flew after the boy to watch and listen. Even outside the once happy store, the sparrow could hear angry voices raised in arguments and insults. The tiny bird landed beneath a bush that once upon a time had held sprays of yellow flowers that smelled like baking honey cakes. Now it was withered and stank of rot. The bird crouched and tried to shake off the terrible pain caused by the sounds of the rudeness and the anger. When the boy arrived at the doorway of the general store, a pretty young girl with dark skin and hair as black as a raven's wing met him at the door. She was about to smile and offer a friendly greeting, but he rudely shouted, "Get out of my way, you stupid girl!" And he stomped into the store. And she stomped off to the post office. The little bird hardly recognized the now angry girl. As the bird flew above her, it noted that the grass below had all turned brown, the bananas had withered on the trees, and the path was now strewn with stinking coconut husks and hurt feelings. The bird flitted from tree to tree in the girl's wake. When it flew closer and inspected her face, the bird realized how much she had changed since the last time he'd seen her. Already at her tender age, there were lines on her forehead and the corners of her mouth drew down. The crane did not reveal itself to her, but continued to watch as she stormed into the post office, said a curt hello to postmistress Miss Tommy. "Now, Weaver, what cause have you to sound so bitter on such a beautiful afternoon?" asked Miss Tommy. "I do believe your face is going to freeze like that if you keep looking like that much longer." Weaver shrugged. She didn't like the way she was feeling either. It was as if she woke warm and dry each morning, but within minutes, it was as if someone had doused her with a pail of cold, sticky glop. "I don't know, I can't shake it," Weaver said. "I'm unhappy all the time. It seems like everyone is angry, like the only thing anyone shares around here anymore is mean-spirited words." Now, Miss Tommy was a wise woman and has been a good friend to the old storyteller. She had seen how the villagers had refused to listen to this young girl and to the stories told to her by the crane. The postmistress knew that many of the villagers were set in their way and were finding it hard to believe that words of wisdom could be given to one so young. Though Miss Tommy had repeatedly tried to console the young storyteller, she had seen the young girl lose her spirit and her confidence. She knew that the girl had stopped telling her stories because the people had stopped listening. Without Weaver retelling the crane's stories, the village had become confused and unguided. Confusion had led to anger, and anger to bitterness. Nobody seemed to know what was missing. They only knew that something was gone. Everything around the village had begun to wither, from spirits to ideas to seeds in the ground, fish in the sea. Miss Tommy looked at the girl. She looked her up and down. "I think you need to go and paint Betty's old house. It needs a new shade of shell pink. And you need to take up your telling again," she told the girl. I can't, Weaver said. "Nobody wants to hear me. It's too embarrassing. I'm no good at storytelling, okay? Betty, she left her task to the wrong person. I'm too weak to speak for the crane." Weaver turned and left the post office and headed down the path towards Betty's old cottage, and as she walked down the dusty road, she heard an awful sound. It was a hissing, screeching sound coming from the storyteller's cottage by the bay. Weaver began to run as the horrible sounds got louder and louder. As she turned into the yard, she saw a fierce black cat and a little sparrow facing off. The cat's back was arched, and it looked like a panther as it stalked around the tiny wounded bird that limped away towards the water. Weaver felt a pang of fear for the tiny creature, but she could not act to save it. The cat's eyes just sent a shiver through her, and she froze in place. The sparrow cried out as the cat drew closer, and suddenly out of the bushes came a little field mouse, then another. And another sparrow flew down and stood beside his wounded fellow. A dozen or so green and red crickets flanked the cat and began to chirp. Immediately, the surrounding area became filled with chirps and squeaks and whirs of the smallest and weakest of creatures in the village. The cat seemed confused at this turn of event. The other creatures posed no physical threat to the cat, but still, he became frightened and confused. He began to whirl back and forth at their sounds. Then the wounded sparrow ceased its calling, and it began to sing. It sang a song so sad, so sweet, and so wondrous that all the village stopped and listened. The cat lowered its hackles and curled into a ball and went into a blissful sleep. Weaver then found that she was no longer standing, but kneeling on the dry brown grass. Her heart suddenly felt light. Her mind at once was more sharp and clear. As the birds sang, she imagined the stories that she would tell to the children of the village and recalled the stories that the crane had told her. Suddenly, the little sparrow was gone, and in its place stood the beautiful white crane. The singing had stopped, but Weaver still swayed a little bit from the strange and healing music that had flowed over the village. Then Weaver bowed her head in shame. "Look up," came the voice of the crane. "Look up and see your old friend and hear me." Weaver looked up, and the crane was right in front of her. She could smell the clean, windy scent that always carried on its wings. She felt the warmth of the bird. It took itself, and she took her to itself and sheltered her in his great wings. "I failed you," she sobbed. I told your stories badly, and now no one will listen." The bird said, "Your telling was fine. It was their listening that failed." "I'm not as strong as Betty was. They're not going to listen to me," Weaver said. The crane replied, "If you have any words at all, you have all the power in the world. Words are powerful things. They can pass on a curse or a blessing from one listener to another. They echo on and can create or destroy. I create and others destroy," the crane continued, "but they cannot destroy you or the stories. Only your will to continue can be lost. Now that you've found it again, you must go on. It is for you and my other tellers to pass on the words that heal and create. When those words stop, only the curse will carry on." Weaver still doubted. What should I tell them to make them listen? How can I make them hear me? The bird spread its wings. "You cannot make another believe or hear. Simply go and tell your tales, even if it's to an audience of one child, or only to the wind or sky. Be brave and believe." The great bird added, "Tell of the wounded sparrow, all alone and cornered by the dark cat. Tell of how even the darkest, most powerful thing can be undone by the beauty of one tiny, tiny creature." Weaver saw this story in her mind. She saw that she too was the wounded sparrow in the village where the dark killing creatures had stalked too long. Dark, hurtful words and deeds that tore at people and left them fearful, angry, and wounded. Weaver recited the words that she had heard Betty say so often to the children of the village. "When the days are long and my heart is sad, I sit by the water and think. And that is when the crane flies to me and tells me of his home in the sky." "My home is wherever our stories fly," the crane told her. The bird spread its white wings and flew high into the sky until it winked away into the rays of the setting sun. And so it was that Weaver came to live in Betty's old cottage and painted it a new shade of shell pink. She spent her days telling her tales. At first, she spoke them only to the tree snails and crickets and little birds that gathered around. Then the children began to wonder at this strange sight, and they came to listen, and their families followed. Weaver sat beneath the palm tree and felt the breeze begin to stir. By and by, her stories healed the village as they passed from one to another. The blessings grew back and echoed with the words of the teller. So it is said, so it was. A little bird told me so. I haven't read these stories out loud in almost 20 years because someone told me that they were a waste of time. Someone told me every day that what I was doing was silly. No one would listen. It was a waste of my time. It was a waste of their time. It was an embarrassment. And when I stopped telling these stories and people stopped hearing these stories, something was lost. And when this lockdown started and I suddenly felt moved to read them again, I felt it all come rushing back. And I think that now we're beyond birds and crickets listening. I hope you'll pass them on and we can heal the rest of this village. Good night.